Let's continue installing Liferay in a full-blown, full-stack application server. We have chosen Wildfly for you, which is what all of these exercises are being built for. But be my guest, if you feel more comfortable with WebLogic, with WebSphere, with JBoss proper, then go ahead and use it. You will find the documentation on customer.liferay.com, because all of these commercial application servers are only available for DXP, so you won't find them on the open source documentation site. But customer.liferay.com requires a login, but then has all of the information ready for you for all of the commercial application servers. Now, we have prepared this Wildfly installation for you with a proper Docker container or Docker image. Not yet, but we have all of the Docker files and then a load of operations. These are now all individual operations, everything that you need in order to install on a full-blown server, full-blown app server. What you need, and this gives me the opportunity to also talk about the preparation for our Tomcat bundle, because it's basically the same. When you install Liferay on a full-blown JBoss or Wildfly versus installing on Tomcat, we need the same because we're not using any of the full-blown server features. We're just installing as a regular web application, which means the principle is the same. You need the app server. You need to configure the application server, for example, with memory use and so on. You will need to install Liferay dependencies, which are some libraries that Liferay requires outside of the web application because they might be shared with other web applications as well. And then we'll configure additional settings, which, well, I've kind of covered that here, the JVM settings. How do you set up your Java virtual machine? Could be memory, could be just diagnostic aspects like putting up the JMX port. Configure the database, configure the mail server. Now, this is something that we especially do in application servers, in full-blown application servers, but it's also not unheard of in Tomcat, and we can talk about that. We will talk about that. You will need to deploy the Liferay WAR file. After all, Liferay is nothing else but a regular web application to this application server. And then, as it says, test and tweak settings as desired. We're going as far as to test settings, and you get the chance to tweak them if you like to. Now, the global dependencies, the very first one of them that you definitely need is the driver for your database. If you use Oracle, if you use MySQL, even if you use HSQL, you will need the driver to connect to that database. In the bundle, we bring the HSQL connector, but anything else you should install, especially for the commercial databases, we just can't deliver them. And even for the open source databases, we shouldn't or we wouldn't deliver them. First of all, because of the licenses, they're open source, but they might not be compatible with ours. Or, and I can state that from MySQL, you should use the client, the JDBC connector, matching your server's version, because there apparently has been some binary protocol change, and running one version with the other on the server side has resulted in several problems early on. I'm not quite sure where they were, between which versions they were, but just use the one matching your database and you should be set. We will also use the Portlet API, we will use the Liferay API and some OSGI container parts. The Portlet API is basically, the Portlet API and the Liferay API is what we share between the different web applications. We install Liferay as a web application, and we can configure other web applications to use the Liferay API. That's why we deploy the Liferay API to the application server and not to Liferay itself. And the Portlet API, I would almost say wrap that into the Liferay API, because for our intents and purposes, it's the same. You're not using the Portlet API without Liferay anyways, but you definitely want to use them in other applications when they integrate with Liferay. And then the OSGI container, there is some component within Liferay that runs a full-blown OSGI container kind of out of the control of the application server. And you will need to grant Liferay access to this OSGI container outside of the directories of the application server, but that's what we cover here as well. Now then, configuration of the server settings, Java memory settings, character set mapping, time zone defaults, database connectors. This points to some of the settings that often go wrong. So let's go through these 4 at least, through the settings that I've seen there. We will cover Java memory settings in the hardening and performance tuning chapter anyways, but let me go as far as Liferay requires some memory. And when you have the choice, so you can have a server with a lot of memory, and you can use that memory for different purposes. I would say rule of thumb for Liferay, you should identify what you need minimally for Liferay. What can you barely run in with the load that you expect, be it 1,000 users, 10,000 users, 100,000 users, however many users you have. Just try to identify the minimum you can get away with and use that as your basis. Of course, you'll add something to it because with a minimum, you would constantly garbage collect. But rather try to orient yourself at the minimum and not at the maximum capacity of your server. If you have a server with 64 gig of RAM, you don't want to use those 64 gig if your minimum configuration is 2 gig. Because what will happen? Java will happily say, oh, I've got enough memory, and use more and more and more and more of that memory. And once garbage collection comes, then it will fix all of that and free up 60 gigabyte at once. And you probably don't want that. You rather want frequent, short interruptions for garbage collection, for freeing up the memory, rather than one humongous, potentially long break. Now, the algorithms are getting better and better, and nobody can ever say firmly that the current algorithm or the current restrictions are valid for the next generation of garbage collectors anyways. But if you can get away with 2 gigs, why allocate 60? It's just a waste of resources. Another setting, and this is also something that I get along in hardening, is that I like to say the minimum settings. You know, there's the 2 parameters for Java, XMS and XMX. The minimum settings that Java allocates immediately, and the maximum settings that it allocates when it needs to. I like to set them to identical values, because if you just say, okay, I'll allocate 4 gigs right now and maximum 8, you can kind of guarantee that the moment you will need those 8 gigs and the operating system doesn't have them anymore, like Java tries to allocate those 4 gigs, those extra 4 gigs, but can't get them from the operating system, I can guarantee that will be Saturday to Sunday night at 3 a.m. when no system administrator is there. So if you want to grant 8 gigs max, just grant 8 gigs, period. Be sure this can be allocated, otherwise startup fails. That's fine. You'd rather want it to fail early than Sunday night at 3 a.m. Character set mapping. Interesting. I would say whenever you deal with character setting, go UTF-8. Go with the same character set everywhere on every single level, because otherwise it's a mess. You'll need the database with a default collation UTF-8. You'll need Liferay and the application server to use UTF-8. On the HTTP level, I would recommend to use UTF-8. Whatever you configure explicitly, make it UTF-8. Because if one of those layers happens to be encoded in a different way, and you get weird, garbled characters on the screen, you first got to identify which of these layers is it. And if it happens to be your database, then you got to migrate all of your data to the new encoding, which, let me tell you, is a mess. So you better get it right immediately. Now, we're recording this session in the US. And as I'm not from the US, I'm from a company where we use these funny letters with the extra dots on top. To us, it's quite easy in Germany. It's quite easy to just identify, hey, encoding went wrong, because all of these funny characters with the dots are scrambled up, garbled up. So for us, it's quick to spot as soon as we put in some German content that probably there's something wrong with the encoding. Okay, let me... It's even easier for all of the Asian or Arabic countries which have completely different character sets. Now, if you are using ASCII largely, and if you don't know how to deal with all of these weird characters, I have one trick for you that I want to share right here. It's not in the material, but if you need test data, just get in here. If you need test data where you can say, where you can immediately tell your encoding went wrong. There's a site called Flip Title. And what you basically say is, you write something, this is some weird character, some from, I don't know where they're from, Korean, Greek, something alphabet, but they're definitely not ASCII. Actually, some of them are. Like the upside down N is a U. So that just works. But you can immediately tell, even if you just know ASCII, you can immediately tell there's something wrong in my encoding. So my recommendation in any QA system, in anything where you actually want to look for data, just use that. Sprinkle it in, you will spot any encoding problems immediately. Fliptitle.com, I really love that site, and I'm happy it's still around. Time zone defaults, almost the same thing applies here. I'm always amused when somebody says, hey, server goes down at noon. Noon what? Right? So your servers should be all on a defined time zone. Now for me, it's easy to just claim, hey, make that UTC. Because I'm typically living in Germany when I'm not here, and UTC is off by 1 or 2 hours, depending on if it's summer or winter. And that's reasonably close to what we have. The server should be all on the same time zone. If nothing else, it's just important that you know exactly what time zone your server is on, what time zone your application is on, and then what's displayed on the user interface is something completely different. We can set up Liferay, actually we will set up Liferay in a way that Liferay knows the current time. And then when I log in and I say, I'm in Germany, then I get my own personal time zone, and it should be calculated correctly. When we're here, where we are in the Los Angeles area, that should be used for anybody logging in from here. When somebody is in China, then we just log in with that time zone. Last but not least, the database connectors, well, I've covered them. You will need them, definitely, because we don't deliver them. These are all the different settings for the database, and specifically, well, with the connectors, that's what we get. Now, there's a bunch of wildfly settings. I'm coming back now from the abstract stuff that you need to do. There's a bunch of wildfly settings or JBoss settings, as they're largely exchangeable. You can manage many of them through the web interface, which is a property of some of these full-blown application servers. You basically click along the web application, the administration interface, and configure everything. You will see all of the steps in your written material. You can set some settings, you actually need to set some settings for Wildfly in XML files, namely modules XML and standalone XML. Now, lucky for me, I don't need to explain them minute by minute or line by line, because they're all provided for you in the exercises material, and they will be all copied into the installation before it started. And you can basically choose if you follow along this exercise by going step by step by step, and those are long steps, or if you look at the solution, which we've provided as well, and use the solution, copy that over, and just inspect the differences. Just see what you're copying over, identify the Docker file, and identify what it copies over. Look at what I had here on the previous page, modules XML and standalone XML. Just look at them, what they configure. You can figure out what they do. This is another hint. This is not a Wildfly training, so we'll cover Wildfly to the point that will make it work. And in order to save resources, you should, by the way, shut down your Tomcat installation, unless you have a bunch of enough RAM in your system. But that's a function of main memory. So if you run Wildfly, then you will have it a little bit easier if you shut down your Tomcat instance. Modules XML covered. Okay, the app servers, and this is also not Wildfly specific, you can deploy in WAR, EAR, or JAR deployment. You can install with an exploded directory, which is basically an unzipped WAR file. And they have several options for hot deployment in there as well. Now for Liferay, we typically use the WAR deployment because we don't need more. We don't need an enterprise application archive, an EAR file. And that can just be deployed as it is and then configured with the management application tools. Now, I told you this is the exercise documentation here. I told you you can choose both. You can choose to go through the individual steps. Those will be really worth to be followed if you are really interested in what happens deep within Wildfly. You will see every individual step. If you say, well, it's quite fine, I just want to get it running on Wildfly and I want to understand what's there, just look at the summary, then find the solution which has all of the Docker instructions, all of the configuration files, and copy them over into your Wildfly directory. That should be relatively straightforward. What you do, or what you will find in the Wildfly folder after you have, or in the Wildfly Docker configuration after you have configured this, is of course various environment variables that try to point us to the regular places like directories or other variables. We'll have another user. We're not running as root, so we're running as an explicit unprivileged user. We'll need dependencies in the container, for example, the database driver. We'll set up Wildfly copy configuration files, and then we're running Wildfly with a last command in there, set up the Docker Compose file, and start the Wildfly server. Now, this is all the exercise, and if I get that right from my memory, those are 6 or 8 pages if you print the book. I'll leave it to you. Choose the solution, check all of the individual steps,